Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I am Tony Gerdeman, here as always with Tom Orr. Tom, how's it going?
Tony, I'm using the correct microphone on this show. We are off to an incredible start already. After 600 or so episodes, I think we've now found every possible way to screw this up. And as long as we don't repeat any of those mistakes, it should be a perfect show from now on.
We are basically the Thomas Edison of podcasts. We've found every single way to do it wrong. And now, perhaps this one episode, will be the encapsulation of doing it correctly. Just one time. That's all you need. You just need one example to show, like, Disney or the ad people. Like, look, like when you do you send in like your Emmy tape or the Oscars. Emmys, you just show in like a scene from an episode or one episode. That you're not sending them the entire season. You only need a snippet to convince people you know what you're doing.
So if we are the Edison of podcasting, who is the Nikola Tesla who we've stolen a bunch of our stuff from to be the famous ones who although I guess people still talk about Teslas, so in a slightly different context now, but
well, yeah, and I don't like the Edison thing because I have always been a Tesla guy. And now I can't. Now you got to be careful when you say I'm a Tesla guy, but I've always been a fan of Nikola Tesla and all of the amazing things that he has done in science, which I also believe in.
Good job, buddy. Well done. So we also believe in you, dear listeners, and we believe that you sent us a bunch of questions, and we believe we're going to get through the rest of them today. We've somehow managed to, you guys barraged us with enough questions that it has turned into a multi-week process, but that's okay. That we, as we have said before, we enjoy answering your questions because that lets us know that this is what you want us to talk about. So that's a good way for us to make sure we're talking about what you want us to talk about. And also it makes our show prep a lot easier. So between those two things, we really appreciate it. So here's the first one for today's show from @DavidHoosier1. Is Zach Harrison the starter at the start of the season, or will one of the young defensive ends take over for good at some point? I don't think Jim Knowles is the type to worry about seniority.
We know Jim Knowles said after the spring game that I don't care who starts, and I think that's the attitude that everybody needs to have on a defensive line. It's you saw last year Haskell Garrett started just a few games, and it was Teron Vincent starting a lot of those games, and nobody's going to say that Haskell Garrett wasn't a starter, but like it's just a label. It's not the most meaningful thing. And the question here, though, is the answer is yes. I think it could be yes on both of those. Is Zach Harrison the starter at the start of the season? Yes. Will one of the young defensive ends take over for good at some point? I could also see that happening, but it's not taking over per se. It's just sometimes Jack Sawyer may start, sometimes Zach Harrison may start. It may be about what you want to do defensively that first series. It may be about the matchup, maybe about the left tackle or the right tackle or the run game or the pass game. So I think there's a bunch of different variables that go into it and into the game planning, to the defensive coordination. What is it we want to accomplish? Who are we facing? What does Zach Harrison do best? What does Jack Sawyer do best? All of this while understanding they're probably going to play roughly the same amount of snaps throughout the season.
Yeah, and to me, we will talk a bunch of times about who's going to be starting this year because that's sort of a neat shorthand way to talk about this sort of stuff. But the number of snaps these guys are playing is, a functionally much more important piece of the conversation than who's out there for the first snap. If you're out there for the first snap and then the other guy plays 60% of the snaps in the game, well, he's kind of more the starter than you are, even if you were the first one out there. And I feel like it's entirely possible Zach Harrison is starting all these games this year and starts the entire season. That's entirely possible. But I also would be very surprised if JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer were not among the very top level of snaps taken at each of those defensive end positions this year. And quite possibly could be number 1 and number 2 by the end of the year. I mean, that is entirely possible. I think you're gonna see them be significant contributors this season, and you're probably looking at them playing more snaps than the older guys 4 to 6 times at least this fall, and that may just be a matchup thing. That may be someone has sort of surpassed people in other areas kind of thing. But yeah, I think you're going to, I think there's a possibility you're going to see Zach Harrison get the start, and that's a little, a nice little ceremonial honor thing. And I would expect him to probably be a captain again this year. But I don't necessarily think he's going to have I really don't think that he's going to have like a huge advantage in the number of snaps this year. I think you're going to see those younger guys playing quite a bit, and potentially even more than some of the older guys are over this course of the whole season.
Yeah, and one last thing, like the Oklahoma State's leading sacker, Colin Oliver, came off the bench. Like he was the number 2 Leo to the number 1 Leo, Brock Martin, who was the senior. And so like Brock Martin, 9 sacks last year, Colin Oliver, the guy who came off the bench with 10.5. So it's if they produce, they'll play, and starting it's something that I think we all worry about, especially on the defensive line more than coaches. Because I for the longest time, I consider there being like 4 starters at defensive end, and it's just who are the 4, basically.
Yeah, and you showing me the snap counts at the end of the game or the end of the season is a lot more meaningful to me than showing me the number of starts a guy has had in terms of like who's really the main contributors to this team this year. Next one from Matt Roto_TT. How much did the linebackers improve this year? The defense was basic in the spring game, but when the ones were in, the linebackers still look like a bit of a concern. This feels like an area where you're going to see potentially the most improvement over the course of the year. Because last year, the linebackers were just kind of like a mess. And, everyone has their own little pet theories on why that is. And that was an Al Washington issue, or that was an overall defensive scheme issue, or that was a running backs or defensive line and linebackers not working well together issue. Like everyone kind of has their own theory. But, the bottom line is the linebackers were kind of a mess last year. This year, Jim Knowles, I think if you have faith in Jim Knowles on the whole to fix the defense, and I think at this point, his polling numbers in across the state of Ohio are probably about 98% approval based on what we've seen so far from him. If you have faith in him to fix the whole defense, his sort of positional specialty is linebacker. So you would certainly think he would be fixing be able to sort out some of the stuff with the linebackers as well, put the linebackers in a better position because, as a linebacker focused guy, he talks about this being a safety driven defense, but if you're the linebacker position coach, you're going to have a pretty good sense for what the linebackers need to be doing. And they talk about him as being a great teacher. Well, then you can communicate to the linebackers what they need to be doing. The raw material they have there at linebacker is pretty good. This is not the single greatest linebacking core in the history of Ohio State football, but this is also a better linebacking core than what he had at Oklahoma State. And so you should be able to get significantly better, at least as good, if not better results from this Ohio State linebacking core as you had at Oklahoma State last year. And they had pretty good results at Oklahoma State last year. So if you're going from kind of a mess to pretty good results, I think that's a pretty significant improvement.
Tom, did you see the clip, the picture that Colton Denning at Dubsco on Twitter posted of the Rose Bowl, which was just an example of the Ohio State defensive trouble / futility. And what it is we're speaking about the linebackers. It's just a snapshot of the 3 linebackers for the Buckeyes going in one direction, pointing one direction, and the quarterback looking in the exact opposite direction, getting ready to throw to the left side. And you've got an open slot guy there, and they're still, it's really jarring and gives you an idea of the confusion that was still going on last year. And it's the first quarter, nothing. And it's just, you see it, and there's this, oh crap, got to run over here, pointing over here. Tommy Eichenberg, I think, is pointing to Cade Stover saying, get over there. Meanwhile, the other slot was left wide open, and Utah made, scored 35 points in that first half. It was a fun time to be alive. So, as we've talked about, Tom, the whole first do no harm type of thing, I think the competence level increases. And yeah, there were some holes in the spring game, but there's also a safety there to then fill the gaps. And Ross Bolton talks more intelligently about what the jobs of the linebackers are. But I think they're going to be more productive. They're going to be I think more aggressive. And I was looking, we've talked in the past, like last year, Oklahoma State's 2 starting linebackers combined for 26 tackles for loss. Malcolm Rodriguez had 15, Devin Harper had 11. Tom, do you know the last time Ohio State had 2 linebackers combined for 26 tackles for loss?
Off the top of my head, I'm going to say it might have been one of the Ryan Shazier years, maybe, because I feel like Ryan Shazier was generally good for a whole bunch of tackles for loss, but I am completely shooting in the dark there. If you told me this is an Andy Katzenmoyer team, I would not completely fall off my chair.
Well, and the reason I was going to pull that stat on you, because I was going to be like, that was 2013 when Ryan Shazier and Curtis Grant, Ryan Shazier had 23.5, and I looked and Curtis Grant had 3.5, so they combined for 27. However, 2019, Tom, would you have ever guessed Malik Harrison 16.5 tackles for loss, Baron Browning 10?
Yeah.
So that one surprised me.
I did not remember Baron Browning having that many. Malik Harrison is, if we ever get asked a question about the most underrated players in Ohio State history, Malik Harrison is kind of at the top of that list. He just kind of gets forgotten, and he's a little like Tyquan Lewis is probably in that conversation. I mean, there's a couple of those guys who didn't come in with a huge recruiting profile and then just turned into just absolute monsters. But yeah, no, that's interesting. I would not have guessed that. Was Ryan Shazier the one before that the 2013 team?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So. Yeah, and there was nothing really close, and so it is interesting that's the year they have Chase Young as well, and he had 21 tackles for loss, and you're thinking, well, gosh, there's nothing left for anybody else, except it's his presence creates opportunities for everybody else. It's not like he's getting all of them. He's creating opportunities for everybody, and if they can get, I'm still fascinated to see what these defensive ends and defensive tackles do in Jim Knowles' defense to make everybody better, because it's not just the safeties or the linebackers. They're just going to be smarter. They are. But how is that defensive line going to make everybody better? And can they? Because I don't know that they necessarily did last year or even, the year before in 2020.
And, that's kind of the typical way you think of a defense being structured, which is the defensive line occupies all the blockers, and then the linebackers come in and make all the tackles. That's how Chris Spielman got to 29 tackles against Michigan the one year. That's kind of the stereotypical way you think about defense, and the defense is obviously changing, and you're Ohio State has had plenty of playmaking defensive linemen over the years, but if you have a Chase Young or a Joey Bosa up there to occupy a couple blockers, well, that gives the that gives the linebackers a lot less to fight through on their way to make those tackles for loss. So yeah, between the upgraded play at linebacker this year and what I think is going to be upgraded performance at defensive end as well, and maybe in the interior of that defensive line and as well, it feels like this should be a much more statistically productive year for those linebackers, in addition to just being a better organized, less horrendous, horrifying screenshot kind of way as well. Next one from at DC Bus. Full disclosure, big fan and realistic Michigan fan. Who is Ohio State's rival? Because it doesn't feel like it should be UM. LOL. I mean, Tony, I don't know how to say this, but it feels like it's still Michigan. Michigan is still the game that it's the end of the season, and Ohio State has played closer games with Penn State than they have with Michigan over the span of the past decade. Just on average, it feels like Ohio State's been in a lot more one possession games with Penn State than they have with Michigan. But it's not like Penn State's winning those games. Penn State hasn't beaten Ohio State since 2016, and before that it was 2011. So, I mean, until someone else comes up and is beating Ohio State consistently, I think you're kind of still defaulting to Michigan. I mean, there's so much more history there with Michigan than there is with anyone else. There's so much more, meaning, so many more championships decided between those two teams. It's the last game of the season. I mean, I don't think there's even anyone close. And, if you want to talk about which team is beating Ohio State more consistently, well, Tony, there's only one team in the Big Ten who would be Ohio State's rival in in that case, and I have 2 words for you, sir. Boiler up.
I was going to say Sparty no, because that's another one. 2013, 2015, of course, 1998 never happened. We know that, but no, it's definitely Michigan, especially even if people were thinking, yeah, it's time for a new rival, and then you lose to Michigan, and it's like, I hate those sons of blanks, and I can't like how many Buckeye fans want to hang 100 this year on Michigan, and just let's just fast forward the season. Let's get to that game. Just the angst and anger that comes from that, because I don't know that Ohio State fans were like, oh man, after that loss to Penn State, like, man, 2017, we're gonna kill those guys. I've got my calendar. I'm checking down the red X on each day. I think this further confirms that Michigan is absolutely Ohio State's rival, and a realistic Michigan fan may, a realistic Michigan fan, I think, should still understand that Ohio State really, 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 really hates you. Like, be self-aware also,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a certain generational aspect to that too, where people our age who were in school in the 90s, like that was the game that ruined every season. And the people who were, in school decades before us, that was the game. That was the game that decided the Big Ten every single year. Like before the Big Ten had a championship game, the Big Ten championship game was the Ohio State-Michigan game, like virtually every year for a stretch of time. So yeah, and that I think it would take a lot for something to unseat that. And, talking about, you mentioned Michigan State, and Michigan State I wrote about this a few years ago. Michigan State doesn't beat Ohio State that often, but when they do, it's just absolutely soul-crushing losses every time. 2015 probably denied them a national championship. 2013 probably denied them a shot at the national championship. 2011 was whatever, 1999 was whatever, but 1998 probably denied them a national championship. 1974 probably denied them a national championship. It's like Ohio State loses to Michigan State in the years when they're terrible, 1987, 1988, 1999, 2011. Like, Michigan State beats all the bad Ohio State teams. But the only other time Ohio State loses is like the worst possible time. So you remember them all, but they don't happen that often. They've played Ohio State a lot more than Purdue has, and they have 3 wins since 1999. Purdue has 4 wins since 2004, 5 wins since 2000, and they play Ohio State like half as much as Michigan State does. Purdue just ruins Ohio State. Like, that's it. Purdue has cut a deal with the devil where they just get to ruin Ohio State football seasons twice a decade, but in exchange, they never make it to the Final Four in basketball. It's like, well, I don't know if they would, make that deal again, but they made it, and the contract is signed in blood. So that's it. That's just we all just have to live with it.
Get used to it. I guess the Michigan fan here, if they're young enough or whatever, it's probably a lot like being a Washington Generals fan and being like, why do the Globetrotters view us as a rival, and why do they keep pummeling us? Can't they just leave us alone? Can't you go play somebody else? And the Globetrotters like, no, we play you guys, and we're going to beat you again in this high school auditorium in the next town over. And that's just what they continue to do. And you got to feel for those season ticket holders of the Washington Generals.
The Troy Smith Bucket of Confetti game, part 3. It is, it is. It feels like there's like a whole generation of Ohio State and Michigan fans who just are not used to that being any kind of a balanced series. Like, this is a wild historical anomaly. We've had kind of like back-to-back wild historical anomalies in that series where generally there are basically 4 stretches of the Ohio State-Michigan series. There's like the first, 15 games or something, or 12 games up until like 19, basically until Chick Harley steps foot on Ohio State's campus. And it's just all Michigan. Michigan started like 13-0-2 in the series, something like that. And then there's like Chick Harley arrives until Earl Bruce gets fired. And then that's basically like Ohio State is like slightly better, a little bit ahead, but it's pretty balanced. And, sometimes the programs are bad, sometimes the programs are good, but the series is pretty balanced. Then there's the 10-1 John Cooper era. And then there's everything since John Cooper left. And so it was like all Michigan, and then very balanced for the vast majority of the series. and then all Michigan again for 13 years, and then all Ohio State again after that. And, the vast majority of the time, it has been a completely balanced series. But if you are, if you're 30 or younger, all you remember is just Ohio State just annihilating Michigan every year. So I understand why it doesn't feel like that. But, as you said, I don't think it's going to take that many Michigan wins to sort of reset that and, let the younger Ohio State fans know that when the older people say, you don't understand, it feels like they're figuring it out pretty quickly. Next one, after from at 304 Ice WOOD with zeros instead of O's for Icewood. At 304 Icewood with zeros instead of O's. There we go. After rewatching the spring game, am I crazy to think Xavier Johnson is a top 18 wide receiver in the Big Ten? Tony, I'm going to need you to show your work on this. Who are the top 18 wide receivers in the Big Ten? That seems like a very random number.
And that's the problem, because what method are you using? What is the metric? I just went through and I just did last year's Big Ten receiving leaders, receptions per game. Now that doesn't, you're going to have Purdue guys in there, but in terms of here's 18 and 19 in terms of receptions per game in the Big Ten. TJ Sheffield at Purdue. He had 36 catches. He averaged 3 catches a game. And then right below him at 2.9 is Cornelius Johnson. Cornelius Johnson had a decent year, 39 catches, 620 yards, 3 touchdowns for Michigan. Can Xavier Johnson do that? I think he could put up some pretty decent numbers in a passing offense like Purdue or Ohio State. We know he was a 3-star receiver, could have gone to a Bowling Green or Kent State, places like that, at North Dakota State and
Iowa State.
And done Iowa State as well, and could have done stuff there. I think he is pretty talented. But obviously it's very difficult to find room for him at Ohio State. I'm not convinced he's not in the top 6 right now in terms of Buckeye receivers. He's going to have a battle for that with Cam Babb and some of these freshmen. But if you're top 6 at Ohio State, does that automatically make you top 18 in the Big Ten?
Yeah, probably. And as you were going, talking about the guys who are in those spots, I was like, yeah, if you put Xavier Johnson on Purdue, he's going to put up 30 catches and 300 and something yards, right? I think absolutely he's in that range. And he's not a top 10 wide receiver in the Big Ten, but if you put him on the right team, or if you put, replace some of the the lesser Big Ten teams, their wide receivers last year, you put him on Indiana, you put him on Illinois, you're going to have some quarterback issues getting him the ball, but he's starting for those teams, I almost unquestionably, right?
Yeah. Can I give you some other names in that area?
Mm-hmm.
You've got Danny Davis at Wisconsin, a little bit below that.
Speaking of quarterback issues.
Again at Wisconsin. The Chris Outman-Bell was a little bit above that, 3.3 receptions per game. But I think there's an argument, like Roman Wilson at Michigan had, 25 catches, not even 2 catches a game last year. I think so much of it is just, if he had the opportunity that a lot of these guys do, I think he could do the same thing. Better, worse, in a range of not marginally different, if not better.
And then, his whole approach to his college career was such an interesting conversation, because you have an opportunity to be a scholarship player at Iowa State, which is, Iowa State is not Alabama, but Iowa State under Matt Campbell's they've been a pretty good program, and you're not going to the, college football playoff, but you're going to pretty decent bowl games, and you're winning 9 games a year. But he chose to go to Ohio State, where he's at a much higher profile program. He's he's getting the ball thrown to him by a much more talented quarterback, and he's in a much more talented wide receiver room, and he's going to much more exciting bowl games. It's just, that's a very interesting, 2 paths diverged, and I took the one less traveled kind of thing, where you would think most guys would take the scholarship and the chance to, be put up a lot of numbers and be a regular contributing starter on a pretty decent team. He's always been a very fascinating character to me in terms of making that choice. And we have talked about if they have right now, as of the time we're recording this, they're at 84 scholarship players. So if they have, depending on if anyone else has left by the time, by the time all is said and done, and if anyone has come in, if they give a scholarship, a walk-on, a scholarship this year, if they have an extra one or two, he's certainly someone who would be kind of on that, at or near the top of that list where he's, fits that like CJ Saunders kind of profile or the Mitch Rossi kind of profile of guy who's been there a while, guy who's been, a contributor, guy who's very, very well regarded by his teammates. Like he feels like he's someone who, if they do have an extra scholarship or two this year, he's someone who certainly would probably be at the top of the list to receive that.
0 catches in his career, Tom. Does he finish with more than that?
I would say yes. I think he's got a. He has a path to the field here where I would assume that, of anyone on the team, Cam Babb is the guy who everyone wants to see get the ball, like have a reception this year more than anyone else. But Xavier Johnson might be number 2 on that list. So I was going to say DeJuan Jones is probably 2A, but yes, that's a good one. Next one from @David Hooser 1. This is a good one. If you and Tom weren't covering Ohio State, which sport/team would you want to cover? Do you have a good answer on this one?
Well, this week I'm thinking something warmer, but you ask me in the summer and I'm not going to be thinking something warmer. I always immediately, when I think about covering Ohio State, and I would still want to cover college football. That's my favorite sport. That's what I love. When you cover Ohio State and it's whatever outing you're going to, whatever press conference you go to, like you are one of 50 people. And I go back to a few years back when Michigan State had some sort of scandal that Mark D'Antonio was getting ready to talk about. And they showed all of the reporters waiting in the hallway to go talk to him. And there were 3 or 4 people there. And I was thinking, my God, that would be a dream.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're one of just a couple of people who cover the team. But Michigan State, I think it would be fun, but they don't necessarily need you. You want to go to kind of a place where there's this mutual usage where in terms of they appreciate the coverage, so they allow you to come watch practice, come talk to the players, where you can grab people who you want, because it's very rigid at Ohio State. I think it'd be fun to go somewhere where, like it used to be at Ohio State, back in the Cooper days, where you just stop by and grab somebody. So I'm thinking, how about something like Cincinnati, where they probably appreciate coverage, but also they're making that move to the Big 12. So things are getting to be bigger. And I don't know that there's a lot of coverage of that. Or how about this one, Tom? UCF,
mm-hmm.
where they are also making that move. And I don't know that anybody cares, but you get to live in Orlando. Or, again, with the Big 12 move, the Houston, which you probably get lost in the sauce there in such a big city. But I think Cincinnati would be neat. I think, obviously, Tom, you're probably going to say Hawaii. And I'll just let you know the gallon of milk in Hawaii is like $18. So good luck if you need organic, because it's going to be $42.
Yeah, and I am with you on, would definitely pick college football. I think everyone would be, when you want to cover the Mets, like, nah, and just leave that alone. I don't want to, being a beat reporter in New York is like the only thing that would compare to being a beat reporter on the Ohio State beat, where there's 100 million people around and, everyone is everywhere. So yeah, I'm with you. I'd want to definitely be on a smaller beat, I think. I have always, for 30 years now, just found the Colorado football program. Like, I don't know what it is about the Colorado Buffaloes, but I have always just loved them. It's the stadium's gorgeous, Boulder's gorgeous. Like, you see the sunset shots over Folsom Field. It just looks incredible. That seems like that is probably, I'm going to guess there's like about 3 people covering that team outside of like student media. So yeah, I think that's I think that would probably be my number 1 pick. Hawaii, I think I think the novelty of Hawaii would wear off after a while. Like, I love Hawaii football. Like, that is one of my like college football sickos things, is just staying up and watching the late night sketchy live streams of Hawaii football games. But yeah, I think Colorado would be my first choice, and I would be completely fine with like Wyoming football or Boise State football, or any of those like western teams up in the mountains. That would be my choice. That is a lifestyle choice in addition to a college football choice. But yeah, that would any of those I think would be right at the top of my list. But yeah, the opportunity to just kind of like have the beat to yourself and be able to do whatever you want. That sounds pretty appealing.
We also grew up at the right time with Colorado, because I agree, Colorado, there's a special place in our age group, I think,
Mhm.
for Colorado football, because for one, the uniforms were awesome, but
Mhm.
they also played a very entertaining brand of football. They ran the option, but they also threw the ball, and they had some really talented players, Mike Pritchard and Cordell Stewart, Westbrook, but Darian Hagan back in the day, where they kept pace and they made things interesting for Nebraska back then. I was going to say Oklahoma, but
Mhm.
Oklahoma started to fade a little bit as well. But and of course the '94 Michigan game with Colorado is always going to put a smile on people's faces. Even if you're a Michigan fan, you can't help but love that game.
I'm again going to need you to show your work on that one, but yeah, I mean, like going back to even like the Salo Nessie Orange Bowl season, yeah, the Cordell Stewart years, the end of the Bill McCartney, the start of like Gary Barnett. When Gary Barnett was out there, they were still a really big deal. Like, I mean, trying to explain to someone right now, like, okay, so Thanksgiving weekend, there were times when the Colorado Nebraska game was the biggest game of the season, and if it wasn't, it was the second biggest game that weekend. It was, the Colorado Nebraska game was always an enormous deal on Thanksgiving weekend. A lot of times that was the Friday game, I feel like. So yeah, that was one. If you were in a certain era, I think Colorado football is definitely something you have at least some affinity for. I am pretty sure I have a Colorado quarter zip pullover thing that I'm pretty sure I've worn on the podcast at some point in the past. So yes, I do have some bona fides in this particular area. Last one from at Dakota Lee Dilly. Tony, here is my last call request. Maybe we can both dunk on Tom's takes. Hurtful, so hurtful. Here's his 5 predictions that will be more accurate than mine. Again, very hurtful. Number 1, there will be a strip sack in a Buckeyes game. Tony, you were saying beforehand, this is his white whale. This is his version of the 220 prediction for the bowl predictions. So there will be a strip sack in a Buckeyes game. CJ Stroud has 4,750 yards passing and 50 plus touchdowns. Number 3, Emeka Egbuka has 2 or more special teams touchdowns. Number 4, Ohio State beats Michigan by 3 touchdowns plus. Number 5, they will be number 1 by the first college football playoff polls. Which of those 5 is the most likely to happen to you, and which of those 5 is the least likely to happen to you?
Well, let's take out number 1, because we know that's going to happen.
Mhm.
There will be a strip sack in a Buckeyes game.
Mhm.
That is going to happen. The other 4, the most likely to happen, Tom, that's a good question. I'm thinking number 1 by the first college football playoff poll, because they'll have Notre Dame in there. Let's see what Notre Dame does. Who else does Ohio State have in that stretch of games that would qualify, that would build their stock, and that would have been some good show prep.
Yeah, they get Wisconsin fairly early, I think, this year, because the first playoff rankings come out like it's basically like Halloween, right?
It's like week 8 or 9.
Week 8 or 9. So yeah, I mean you've got the Notre Dame game, and I think Ohio State's going to come in ranked pretty high, and you're going to potentially have a big win over Notre Dame week 1, and then you've got a road trip to Michigan State in early October. And I don't know if you have the schedule pulled up, but I'm thinking they have. Yeah, who else do they have before when you think the?
Well, Wisconsin is week 4. They're at Michigan State week 6, and then Iowa week 8, and then week 9 is at Penn State. But they've got some guys.
Yeah, those are enough. That's enough where if you've won a couple of those decisively and you're undefeated, I think you're very much in that number one conversation. And Alabama has Texas early, I know.
So yeah, they open with Texas, or week 2 in Texas, but week 5 at Arkansas, week 6 Texas A&M, week 7 at Tennessee. So that's going to be tough to top Texas A&M in terms of has Ohio State played somebody better than Texas A&M, which we know Texas A&M will have the SEC bump. Tennessee may have it at that point too, and they may start with it, and they may not have anybody to knock them off. Well, yeah, Tennessee will probably have a loss or two coming into that game as I look at games at Pitt, against Florida, and at LSU. I don't think they're going to be undefeated there, but gosh, now looking at those schedules, Tom, do I want to change my answer to because I think the two most likely are number one by the first college football poll and beat Michigan by 3 touchdowns. I don't know that 50 touchdowns. If 15 games, I think 50 touchdowns happens.
Yeah, and 47-50 and 50 touchdowns is essentially the 2018 Dwayne Haskins season. Dwayne Haskins was like 4,800 passing yards and exactly 50 passing touchdowns. So it's basically, will he have exactly the Dwayne Haskins year? And I think the two things that are going to be working against him on that is, number one, they're going to have a better running game this year. So that is, you're not going to be forced to throw the ball in short yardage and goal line situations in the way we're in the Haskins 2018 season. The second thing, you've got a defense that is probably not going to put you in as many shootouts as the 2018 defense did or the 2021 defense did. Like, I think that 2021 was maybe the year that was set up for CJ Stroud to have like the complete monster blow up stat year in terms of throwing the ball and passing for touchdowns, because you had two of the same issues that you had in 2018. Not a lot of great short yardage running plus a bad defense. This year, those issues being fixed, like, that's great. That's great for Ohio State's chances to play 15 games this year, but it probably is not going to keep, it's probably not going to help CJ Stroud hit those numbers. So yeah, I think the number one by the first college football playoff poll is the most likely. And I think by a wide margin, Emeka Egbuka having 2 or more special teams touchdowns is the least likely, because we've talked about the last kickoff return being by Jordan Hall against Michigan in 2009, the last kickoff return for a touchdown by a Buckeye. When was the last time they had a punt return for a touchdown? It feels like it's been several years since we've seen one of those, too.
I know Chris Fields had one in like 2013. Did KJ Hill ever return a punt? I mean, I've got the stats here. I could just go ahead and look for it as I look. 44 touchdowns for CJ Stroud last year in 12 games, Tom. That's, and 4,400 yards passing. Like, he should do all of those. He should match these numbers. However, they're going to be able to run the ball. Defense is going to be better, obviously, and it's you won't need it as much. And let me go through here and look.
Yeah, it is the Stroud thing is interesting because, if you prorate those numbers instead of 12 games over 15 games, he obviously goes way over those numbers last year. But for the two reasons I laid out, it maybe is a little less likely, but he doesn't have to do quite that much. He can do 90% of that. And if you prorate it over 50 games and he stays healthy, then he probably does get there anyway. So, that and the 3 touchdown win over Michigan, they're both reasonable. They're both in play this year, but I think you'd have to have a lot, they're not impossible. You need to have a lot to go right there. So those are kind of in that middle tier to me. And the Emeka Egbuka 2 special teams touchdowns is definitely the least likely of those 4. Tony, have you figured out the answer?
Yes. And if I tell you, the Indiana game in 2014.
Okay. Oh yeah, the Jalen Marshall. Yeah, I was going to say I've been back on the beat since 2017, and I couldn't remember one off the top of my head. I remember plenty of kickoff for touchdowns against Ohio State. I don't know that I've seen a punt return against Ohio State for a touchdown.
We're not counting the Sevyn Banks return of Chris Olave.
Well, that's a blocked punt. Yeah, not a true punt return. Yeah,
but yeah, Jalen Marshall 4 touchdowns in that Indiana game.
Yes, that was. That was a pretty memorable one. I've told this story in the podcast before, but that was a game that I went to with my daughter, who was 4 at the time, and it was a day when there was freezing rain, and someone just gave us tickets because it was like, well, I don't want to go to the game, so why don't you take these? So we drove in, and it was the third quarter, end of the third quarter. And again, she's 4 years old, and it's really cold. And as we were walking out of the stadium, Indiana scored a touchdown to take the lead. So I was walking out of the stadium saying, absolutely, you know what this team's about to do? Win the national championship. This team losing to Indiana at home in the third quarter. That's about what's about to happen. And I was right, but unfortunately we didn't have a podcast then. So that would have been like a 5-point bold prediction. And I would have been right, but we didn't have a podcast. So, oh well.
Anything else, Tom? I think we've defeated all of the questions finally. It only took us 13 weeks.
Yeah, it was. We are truly grateful for those questions because it's as we've said, like we're not here to hear ourselves talk, no matter what it may seem like. We are not here to hear ourselves talk. We're here to talk to you guys about what you want to hear about, and asking you questions is a great way to do that. So I'm going to guess, Tony. I'm going to go out on a limb and guess this is not, in fact, the last time we will do listener questions, especially during the off season. We like doing these shows, but generally, once you're in the rhythm of the season, it's you end up having certain shows you're sort of doing because that's what the news of the day is. When there's a little less news of the day, well, this is a good time to do listener question shows. So we will you will see Tony put out a call for those on Twitter and on the Ask the Insiders board at some point. So follow him on Twitter or pay attention to the Ask the Insiders board, and you too can ask a question that we will answer if we like it.
Yeah, and you don't have to wait till I put out the call because some of these we'll throw in. We've got a Google Doc that I usually just keep, and so if you ever get the it strikes you that you want to throw a question at us, go ahead and I'll put it on the list for whenever we actually start doing these again. And again, as Tom said, it's the off season, so we try to do these as much as possible because it saves me from having to come up with stuff to talk about, which is the most important thing that you can do for us, other than liking, subscribing, reviewing, all of that good stuff as well. So that will do it for this episode. As always, thank you guys for tuning in, and we will talk to you later.